On a freezing afternoon in June of 1931, a small group of men stood in the snow on the desolate coast of East Greenland. The wind was howling down from the ice cap, whipping their fur parkas and stinging their faces. They were hundreds of miles from civilization. To the west lay the massive, uncharted white expanse of the Greenland ice sheet. To the east lay the gray storm-tossed waters of the North Atlantic. These men were not soldiers. They were trappers, hunters, and explorers. They were rough men with weathered faces and hands calloused from skinning foxes and handling rifles. The leader of the group was a Norwegian named Hallvard Devold. He stepped forward to a wooden flagpole they had erected near their small hunting cabin at a place called Myggbukta, which translates to Mosquito Bay. With freezing fingers, he raised a flag. It was not the White Cross of Denmark which claimed sovereignty over the island. It was the Blue Cross of Norway. As the flag snapped in the wind, Devold took a breath and shouted into the empty Arctic air, "In the name of the King of Norway, I occupy the land of Erik the Red to the south and to the north." With those words, he had just invaded a continent. He had just stolen a territory the size of France from the Kingdom of Denmark. A telegraph message was sent from their tiny radio station, beaming the news across the ocean to Oslo. When the message arrived, it did not cause a panic. It caused a celebration. In Norway, the public cheered. They felt they were reclaiming their birthright. But in Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, the news hit like a bomb. The Prime Minister of Denmark, Thorvald Stauning, was a man of peace, a bearded socialist who believed in diplomacy. But this was an act of war. A foreign power had seized Danish territory. The press went wild. Maps were printed, showing the new Norwegian territory carved out of the Danish kingdom. The world held its breath. In previous centuries, this would have been the moment the battleships were mobilized. This would have been the moment the troops were loaded onto transport ships. Everyone expected Denmark to send the navy to shell Mosquito Bay and arrest the intruders. But Denmark did something that no one expected. They did not send an admiral. They sent a lawyer. They did not fire a cannon. They filed a lawsuit. This is the story of the strangest conflict in the history of the Arctic. It is the story of how two brother nations, Denmark and Norway, nearly went to war over a frozen wasteland. It is the story of a forgotten treaty, a drunken conversation, and a legal battle that established who owns the top of the world. It is the story of the only time in history that an entire country was won, not on the battlefield, but in a courtroom. To understand why these 5 Norwegian trappers raised that flag in 1931, we have to go back over 1,000 years. We have to understand the deep wound that sat in the heart of the Norwegian soul. To the Norwegians, Greenland was not Danish. It was theirs. It was the Norwegians who had discovered it. Erik the Red, who settled it in 982, was a Norwegian exile. The Vikings who lived there for 5 centuries were Norsemen. They spoke the Norse tongue. They paid taxes to the King of Norway. For centuries, Greenland was a crown colony of the Norwegian throne. It was part of the Norgesveldet, the Norwegian Empire, which stretched across the North Atlantic. But history is cruel. In the 14th century, Norway was ravaged by the Black Death. The kingdom was so weakened that it entered into a union with Denmark. It was called the Kalmar Union. For 400 years, the two countries were united. The capital was in Copenhagen. The king was Danish. Norway was essentially a junior partner, a province. And along with Norway, all of its colonies, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, came under the administration of Copenhagen. Then came the Napoleonic Wars. This was the moment of the Great Theft. In 1814, Europe was being redrawn. Denmark had made the fatal mistake of siding with Napoleon. When Napoleon was defeated, the victors punished Denmark. In the Treaty of Kiel, Denmark was forced to give Norway to Sweden. But the Danish negotiators were clever. In the fine print of the treaty, they included a clause that said, Denmark would cede the territory of Norway, but would retain the overseas possessions of the Norwegian crown. The Swedish and Norwegian negotiators, perhaps tired or perhaps not paying attention to the icy rocks in the North Atlantic, signed the paper. In the stroke of a pen, Norway lost everything. They gained their independence from Denmark only to be swallowed by Sweden, but they lost their history. Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands remained with Denmark. For over 100 years, this loss ate away at the Norwegians. They felt they had been robbed. They watched as Denmark claimed the glory of the Viking explorers. They watched as Denmark reaped the profits from the Greenland trade. By the early 20th century, Norway had become fully independent from Sweden, and a new wave of nationalism was sweeping the country. A new generation of Norwegians looked at the map and felt a burning sense of injustice. They looked at East Greenland, and they saw a vacuum. Denmark inhabited the west coast of Greenland. That is where the capital Nuuk was located. That is where the people lived. But the east coast was empty. It was thousands of miles of uninhabited ice and rock. It was a place of polar bears and storms. The Danish presence there was non-existent. Norwegian trappers began to move into this vacuum. In the 1920s, intrepid hunters like Hallvard Devold began sailing to East Greenland to hunt fox and bear. They built cabins. They named the fjords with Norwegian names. They felt they were the true owners of the land. They argued a legal concept known as terra nullius. Terra nullius is a Latin term meaning nobody's land. In international law at the time, the argument was that you could not own land you did not use. If Denmark was not living in East Greenland, if they had no police there, no towns there, and no administration there, then they did not own it. It was free for the taking. The tension began to rise in 1930. Denmark, sensing the Norwegian ambition, decided to clamp down. They announced a new policy. They declared that all of Greenland was a closed country. They required all non-Danish ships to get a permit to land. They were essentially telling the Norwegian trappers that they were trespassing. This was the spark. In Norway, the trappers were outraged. They formed a lobby group. They had powerful friends in the government, including a man named Vidkun Quisling, who was the Minister of Defense. Quisling, who would later become infamous as a Nazi collaborator, was a fierce nationalist. He urged the Norwegian government to act. He argued that if they didn't claim East Greenland now, they would lose it forever. Hallvard Devold, the leader of the trappers, decided to force the government's hand. He organized the flag planting at Mosquito Bay specifically to create a crisis. He knew that once the flag was up, the Norwegian government would have to support him or look weak. He was right. When the news of the occupation reached Oslo, the government debated for days, but the public pressure was too great. On July 10, 1931, the King of Norway issued a royal decree. Norway officially annexed the land, claiming it as Erik the Red's land. The invasion was official. The map of the world had changed. In Copenhagen, the reaction was one of cold fury. The Danes saw this as a stab in the back. They saw it as a violation of international order. But Thorvald Stauning, the Danish Prime Minister, was a pragmatist. He knew that a military conflict in the Arctic was impossible. Denmark had a small navy. Norway had a small navy. Sending ships into the crushing ice pack to fight over a frozen bay would be suicidal and expensive. Stauning also knew that he had a weapon more powerful than a battleship. He had the law. After the horrors of World War I, the nations of the world had tried to build a new order. They had created the Permanent Court of International Justice located in The Hague in the Netherlands. It was the predecessor to the modern International Court of Justice. It was a place where civilized nations were supposed to settle their disputes without bloodshed. Denmark decided to bet everything on this court. They filed a suit against Norway, demanding that the annexation be declared illegal and that Danish sovereignty over all of Greenland be recognized. It was a massive gamble. International law regarding the Arctic was murky. No one really knew if you could own a block of ice that you didn't live on. If Denmark lost, they would lose half of Greenland. They might eventually lose it all. The stage was set for the trial of the century. Both nations began to assemble their teams. They didn't hire generals. They hired historians. They didn't stockpile ammunition. They stockpiled old maps and treaties. They scoured the archives of Europe looking for proof of ownership. Denmark's legal team was led by some of the most brilliant minds in international law. They knew they had to prove two things. First, they had to prove that Denmark had displayed the intent and the will to act as the sovereign over the whole island, not just the west coast. Second, they had to prove that other nations, including Norway, had accepted this claim in the past. This search for evidence led them to a dark secret. A skeleton in the closet of Norwegian diplomacy. While the lawyers were digging through the files in the Danish Foreign Ministry, they found a memo. It was a record of a conversation that had taken place 12 years earlier in 1919. The conversation was between the Danish Foreign Minister and the Norwegian Foreign Minister, a man named Niels Claus Alen. It had happened over drinks during a diplomatic conference. It was informal. It was casual. But the memo recorded that Alen had made a promise. According to the Danish notes, the Danish minister had asked Alen if Norway would object to Denmark extending its sovereignty over all of Greenland. And Alen reportedly replied that the Norwegian government would not make any difficulties in the settlement of this question. The Danish lawyer stared at the paper. This was it. This was the smoking gun. It was a verbal promise made by a foreign minister. In the world of diplomacy, a verbal promise is binding. Norway had already agreed to give up Greenland years ago and they had forgotten about it. They called it the Island Declaration. Denmark kept this card close to their chest. They prepared their case meticulously. They gathered evidence of Danish scientific expeditions to the east coast. They gathered evidence of Danish laws that applied to the whole island. They built a wall of paper that they hoped would be strong enough to stop the Norwegian annexation. Meanwhile, in Norway, the mood was confident. They believed the terra nullius argument was unbeatable. They looked at the map and saw thousands of miles of empty coast. How could Denmark own that? It defied common sense. They believed the judges in The Hague would see the reality on the ground. They believed that the spirit of the Vikings was on their side. The Norwegian defense team focused on the lack of effective occupation. They argued that sovereignty requires boots on the ground. They pointed out that for centuries, the only people on the east coast were the Inuit, who were nomadic and certainly not Danish subjects in the traditional sense, and the Norwegian trappers. They argued that Denmark was claiming a phantom empire. As the date of the trial approached, the tension in Scandinavia was palpable. Boycotts were organized. Norwegian goods were shunned in Denmark. Danish goods were shunned in Norway. Friendships were broken. The press on both sides whipped up nationalist fervor. But in the quiet halls of the Peace Palace in The Hague, the judges were getting ready. There were 15 judges from all over the world. There was a Japanese judge, a Cuban judge, an American judge. They were impartial observers who cared nothing for Viking emotions. They only cared about the law. The oral arguments began in 1932. The courtroom was packed. Diplomats, journalists, and spies from every major power were there. They knew that this case would set a precedent not just for Greenland, but for the Antarctic, for the Spitsbergen archipelago, for every unclaimed territory left on Earth. The Danish advocate stood up. He was calm. He was methodical. He laid out the history of the Kalmar Union. He laid out the Treaty of Kiel. And then he played his ace. He revealed the Iceland Declaration. He argued that a foreign minister speaks for the king. When Niels Claus Ellen told Denmark that Norway would not object, he signed a binding contract on behalf of his nation. Norway could not take back its word just because the political winds had changed. The Norwegian team was blindsided. They tried to argue that Ellen was just speaking informally. They tried to argue that he didn't have the authority to give away a continent over drinks. They tried to argue that the memo was not a treaty. But the damage was done. The judges looked at the evidence. They saw a nation that had tried to have it both ways. The arguments dragged on for months. Thousands of pages of documents were submitted. The judges retired to consider their verdict. Back in Mosquito Bay, Hallvard Devold and his men were still manning their station. They were enduring the long, dark winter waiting for news. They kept the Norwegian flag flying. They patrolled their territory. They believed they were the vanguard of a new Norwegian province. They dreamed of a future where East Greenland would be dotted with Norwegian towns, where the fishing fleets of Oslo would dominate the waters. They did not know that their fate was being decided by men in wigs and robes thousands of miles away. They did not know that the age of the explorer was ending and the age of the lawyer was beginning. As 1932 turned into 1933, the world waited. The verdict was scheduled for April 5th. It was a day that would decide the fate of the Arctic. If Norway won, the Arctic would become a free-for-all. Every nation would race to plant flags on uninhabited rocks. If Denmark won, it would cement the idea that borders are fixed by law, not by presence. The sun rose over The Hague. The judges filed into the Great Hall. The president of the court cleared his throat. He held the document that contained the judgment. The Danish and Norwegian delegations sat stone-faced. The judgment was read out. It was long and complex. But it boiled down to one sentence that would echo through history. We will continue the story in part 2, where we will examine the verdict, the dramatic reaction in Oslo and Copenhagen, and the lasting legacy of the lawsuit that gave Denmark the keys to the north. We will see how this legal battle prevented a war but left a scar that would take decades to heal. The Great Hall of Justice in the Peace Palace at The Hague was silent as a tomb on the morning of April 5, 1933. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and old paper. The 15 judges sat in a semicircle on the Hague bench, looking down at the anxious delegations from Denmark and Norway. The president of the court, a stern Japanese diplomat named Mineachiro Adachi, adjusted his spectacles and began to read the final judgment. It was a document that ran for over 100 pages, a dense thicket of legal French and English. But every word was a hammer blow that would shape the future of the Arctic. The Norwegian delegation, led by their most brilliant legal minds, leaned forward. They had built their entire case on the concept of terra nullius, the idea that because Denmark had no towns or police on the east coast of Greenland, the land belonged to no one. They were confident that the logic of effective occupation would prevail. They believed that you could not own a frozen wilderness simply by drawing a line on a map. But as Judge Adachi read the findings, the Norwegian confidence began to crumble. The court began by addressing the history. They acknowledged the ancient Norse settlements, but they ruled that when the Kalmar Union was dissolved, the sovereignty over Greenland had legally passed to Denmark alone. They accepted the Danish argument that the Treaty of Kiel in 1814 had been a binding legal transfer of all the colonies. Then the court turned to the crucial question of occupation. The judges ruled that in the Arctic, the standards for occupation were different. In a temperate country like France or Germany, you needed soldiers and tax collectors in every village to prove you owned it. But in a desolate polar region where life was barely possible, the standard was much lower. The court ruled that Denmark only needed to show the intent and the will to act as sovereign. They pointed to the Danish scientific expeditions. They pointed to the trade monopolies. They pointed to the treaties Denmark had signed with other nations that included Greenland. The court effectively said that you didn't need to live on every square inch of the ice to own it. You just needed to act like the landlord. And then came the final nail in the coffin, the Ellen Declaration. The court addressed the drunken promise made by the Norwegian foreign minister in 1919. The judges were unequivocal. They ruled that a reply of this nature given by the Minister for Foreign Affairs on behalf of his government is binding upon the country to which the minister belongs. The court declared that Norway had already promised not to interfere. The invasion was illegal, not just because of geography, but because Norway had broken its word. The final verdict was delivered. By a vote of 12-2, the Permanent Court of International Justice ruled in favor of Denmark. The Norwegian occupation of East Greenland was declared invalid and illegal. The Blue Cross flag that Hallvard Devold had raised at Mosquito Bay had to come down. The land of Erik the Red was Danish. The news flashed across the telegraph wires to Scandinavia. In Copenhagen, the streets erupted in joy. People waved Danish flags and sang patriotic songs. Prime Minister Thorvald Steining was hailed as a genius who had saved the kingdom without firing a shot. It was a vindication of his policy of peace and law. In Oslo, the reaction was one of shock and bitterness. The newspapers ran headlines bordered in black. It was a national humiliation. The dream of a greater Norway of reclaiming the Viking heritage was dead. The trappers and hunters felt betrayed by their own diplomats who had made careless promises years ago. But then something remarkable happened. Something that stands as a testament to the civilization of the Nordic countries. In many other parts of the world, such a verdict might have been ignored. A losing nation might have refused to leave. They might have kept their soldiers on the ground and dared the world to remove them. But Norway did not do that. The Norwegian government, despite the anger of the public, accepted the verdict. They respected the rule of international law. They sent a message to Hallvard Devold at Mosquito Bay. They ordered him to lower the flag. Imagine the scene at that lonely cabin in the Arctic. Devold and his men who had risked their lives to claim this land had to walk out into the snow and undo their work. They lowered the Norwegian flag and packed it away. They did not burn the station. They did not sabotage the equipment. They simply accepted that the gavel had spoken louder than the gun. They left East Greenland. The crisis was over. But the legacy of this lawsuit was just beginning. The verdict in the Eastern Greenland case became the bedrock of international law regarding territory. It established the legal precedent that is still used today. It established that sovereignty can exist over remote, uninhabited areas without physical occupation. This ruling is the reason why the map of the Arctic looks the way it does today. It is the reason why Canada can claim the vast, uninhabited islands of the high north. It is the reason why Russia can claim the frozen wastes of Siberia. The court legitimized the idea of owning the wilderness. For Denmark, the victory was absolute. It secured their hold on the largest island in the world. It meant that Greenland would remain a unified territory under the Danish crown. It meant that when the strategic value of Greenland exploded during the Cold War with American bases and nuclear radars, it was Denmark that held the keys, not Norway. But there is a dark irony to this story. A twist involving one of the key players. Vidkun Quisling, the Norwegian Minister of Defense who had pushed so hard for the invasion, was humiliated by the loss. He saw the Danish victory as a sign of Norwegian weakness, and this bitterness festered in him. It contributed to his radicalization. Years later, when the Nazis invaded Norway in 1940, Quisling would betray his own country and become a puppet dictator for Hitler. His name became a synonym for traitor. It is strange to think that his path to treason began partly with a failed lawsuit over a frozen bay in Greenland. The case also had a profound effect on the Inuit people of Greenland, though they were never consulted during the trial. The verdict ensured that Greenland remained a single political entity. If Norway had won, Greenland might have been partitioned. The east coast might have become a Norwegian territory, while the west coast remained Danish. The Inuit people would have been divided by a hard border. The modern movement for Greenlandic independence relies on the fact that they are one people on one island. The lawyers in The Hague unknowingly saved the unity of the Greenlandic nation. Today, if you go to East Greenland, you can still find the remains of the Norwegian stations. The cabin at Mosquito Bay still stands preserved as a historical site. It is a lonely monument to the ambition of the trappers. But the most important monument is invisible. It is the line on the map, the border that surrounds Greenland. That line exists because of the legal war of 1933. The conflict between Denmark and Norway is now forgotten by most of the world. The two countries are close allies. But every time you look at a globe and see the massive white shape of Greenland, colored in the same shade as the tiny islands of Denmark, you are looking at the result of that lawsuit. It reminds us that history is not always made by generals and conquerors. Sometimes it is made by bored diplomats having drinks in a hotel room making promises they do not expect to keep. Sometimes it is made by judges reading dry texts in a quiet room. The court case that decided the fate of the Arctic proved that the pen can indeed be mightier than the sword. It proved that nations can settle their disputes with arguments instead of artillery. In the end, the Vikings did not lose Greenland because they were weak. They lost it because they didn't read the fine print. And when the new Vikings tried to take it back, they were defeated not by a shield wall but by a legal brief. The Danish flag, the Danebrog, still flies over the weather stations of East Greenland. It snaps in the same wind that Hallvard Devold felt on his face. But now it flies with the undisputed authority of international law. The continent was won and the only casualty was the pride of a brother nation. This is the story of the lawsuit war. A war without dead but with a victor that took it all. A reminder that, in the game of geopolitics, the best weapon is not a rifle but a really good lawyer. This is John, and this is the Untold History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.